I'm Joe from As the Joe Flies.
And I'm Leslie from Trips with Tykes.
And welcome back to Disney Deciphered. So we're still in New Year's mode, even though when you're listening to this, it's probably going to be February. We thought we'd do something a little bit new this year. So we talked about when to visit Walt Disney World in episode 353. So you can go back and check that out if you'd like. But thanks to one of our Patreon subscribers, Steve, he asked if we could do a companion episode on when to visit Disneyland in 2025. So since you may want to consider skipping Disney World in 2025, we'll help you to figure out when's the best time to visit Disneyland in 2025 if you're going to do that instead. Before we get started, Leslie, why don't you remind us what Patreon is and how people can subscribe?
Sure. So if you want to support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Disney Deciphered. And we have different levels of support and we give you lots of bonuses. With that support, you can join our Facebook group, you get ad-free listening, and we have our unfiltered episodes and real-time trip reports. So thanks so much to everybody past and present who has supported, and we have a lot of fun with our group of folks.
Indeed, our merry band. Okay, so let's get started. So in episode 353 for Walt Disney World, we had an extended discussion about whether you should visit Walt Disney World in 2025 or wait. I don't think it's going to be as complicated for Disneyland. Unlike Walt Disney World, there are not the level of closures that are happening. Disneyland is mostly open. The closures are minimal. Honestly, by the time you're listening to this, they're basically over. The major closure is the Red Car Trolley is closing on February 9th, which is an attraction, but it was a cute thing. I mean, I will miss it. I think it brought a lot of good ambiance. That was in Disney California Adventure. And then the other closures, It's a Small World, Grizzly River Run, the monorail. These are things that, It's a Small World is classic, but also can get on people's nerves. So not huge closures, definitely not on the scale that we're seeing at Walt Disney World.
Yeah, these are pretty short-lived, and most of them are front-loaded to the beginning of the year. And the reason will become obvious as this episode goes along. There's something big happening starting in May of 2025. The 70th anniversary is kicking off. So Disney is trying to get like those final bits and pieces at Disneyland fixed and ready to go, but they don't want to have major closures during the 70th. That's what they're aiming for. So that's why we're getting the smaller closures the beginning of the year. And a lot of these are just usual refurbs. I mean, Grizzly River Run's always closed in January, February. So that's what they're aiming towards. But this year, in contrast to Walt Disney World, this is a year where everything's kind of open, Joe. Like, it's kind of hard to believe.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, because they want to have everything open for the 75th too. So they're going to have to squeeze in some major closures between now and then. I know that the 50th at Walt Disney World ended up being a little bit of a bust. I mean, pandemic related, of course, or that had a big effect on it. For Disneyland, I feel like they always do these anniversaries very well. They use it as a good excuse to do a little bit of a refresh, do a little bit of a touch up, sell a lot of merch. So have they told us yet what we have to look forward to in the 70th, or we're still waiting for that?
No, we have the basic parameters right now. So we know that the 70th is going to launch on May the 16th of 2025. And we know sort of the big pieces that are coming along with that. We're getting a lot of parades and shows and entertainment along with that. I mean, some fan favorites are coming back. We're getting back Paint the Night. We're getting back Wondrous Journeys. We're getting a new World of Color show. So a lot of things coming back with that. And then they've announced that that is going to continue through summer 2026. So usually the way Disney does these anniversaries at Disneyland, usually they launch at the beginning of one summer. They go all the way through the next summer, but we don't have that confirmed. We don't have an end date, but I think it's safe that at least like June and July of 2026, it'll continue into, and then at some point in August, I think probably around Halloween time will be when it ends.
Yeah, so that is pretty exciting, and I do feel like Disneyland does a great job with these anniversaries. The other thing to note is we said that at Walt Disney World there are a lot of discounts because they have to attract people to come with Epic Universe opening, with all the stuff they have closed, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the good news is Disneyland itself still has some discounts. They have room discounts running through the spring, but the really great discounts are the kids' tickets for $50 a day. Those run through March 20th. And that's a good deal. Of course, a kid is 9 years old or less. And then for Southern California residents, they have a ticket deal running through May 15th. And I don't know, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw another, maybe not as good as the $50 a day kids ticket deal, but some sort of ticket deal in the summer, as I feel like Disneyland over the last couple years has been doing a good job discounting their tickets a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So watch for what's going to happen in the summer. I think a lot will depend on sort of what the demand is for the 70th as to whether and how long we'll get a ticket deal. But last summer it went well into September, if I'm remembering correctly. So watch for that. But I mean, I don't know if it'll launch right there around the 70th. So they're going to want to make the most of those first few weeks. I think when demand is going to be high for folks wanting to see that. But yeah, lots of good deals for tickets but not really deals for hotels. I mean, we still have that capacity limitation at Disneyland, just those 3 on property hotels, and Pixar Place is more popular than ever because it's new and fresh. And so the only deals I'm seeing, Joe, are for people who are willing to stay in one of those hotels 4 or more nights. And that's not the vast majority of Disneyland visitors. So stay off property, save some money, and then get the discounts on your tickets.
Pixar Place proves that the 6th time is a charm when you're doing a hotel refurbish. I know I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it feels like it was 6 different versions of that hotel. But glad that Disney has finally figured that out. In terms of the crowds and demand, I think our prediction is that there are going to be people, and we've said this for years, if you live in the middle of the country, even the Midwest, maybe consider going west to California. Maybe it's an extra hour or 2 on the flight, but Disneyland is just way less complicated, way easier to do. It's the original park. So I do think that if some people choose not to go to Disney World this year, we may see some of those Disney fans, maybe people who take Disney trips every 1 or every 2 years, maybe they go west instead of going southeast.
Yeah, I think we're going to definitely see some of that. I mean, I'm seeing it myself just among my circle of friends and followers. Like people are DMing me saying, "Hey, we're Disney World folks," but thinking about that first Disneyland trip this year. So I think there's that may be a trend. And as a result, I'm sorry to say I don't know if there will be that many low crowd times at Disneyland. But the good news is there aren't that many closures. So hopefully Disneyland will be able to absorb increased demand if it does materialize.
All right, so that is the overview. Let's get into our breakdown of what to expect at Disneyland month by month. We'll get right into that, but before we do that, we'll take a quick break. All right, Leslie, I now have a 12-year-old in the household, which is shocking, and it happened too quickly. But that means that the year of the dragon is over, and it is the year of the snake. And Lunar New Year is January 29th this year. Disneyland is celebrating that from January 16th to February 17th. This is the first big thing that's happening at Disneyland. I mean, Disneyland always does a great job with all these different festivals and overlays. And so Lunar New Year is where we're kicking things off in the year 2025.
Yeah, that's right. So you get that I kind of longer than ever. This used to be maybe just like a 1 or 2 week festival, then it became a 3-week festival. Now it's a full month spanning Lunar New Year, where it falls right there pretty much in the middle. So that's the big thing happening in the first 2 months of the year. And I love it. It's a smaller festival, fewer number of booths, smaller entertainment compared to the other food festivals in DCA, but it's really cute. And I love the food, Joe. So I'm going to be going myself in early February. So I've enjoyed it the last couple of years. Glad to get to be going back. So for those of you who are planning January, February vacations, I mean, January is almost over. So you're probably hearing this too late, because one of the best times to go is in late January when crowds are really low, that festival's happening, MLK is done, President's Week hasn't started. So that's a great little window to look for. But in terms of dealing with crowds and when you should go in this window, I mean, you really have to just watch for those 3-day weekends, President's Week especially, the entire week, because a lot of school systems have that whole week off as a ski week in California. So the weekend of President's Day itself and then the following weekend can both be really, really crowded. And then, of course, you also have to watch for those refurbs that we talked about. And they're not as many this year, but they are significant. They do affect ride capacity and crowds. So watch for that around President's Week. They do try to get some of those rides open before President's Week because of the demand, but I do think there's some sweet spots in January and February, and of course the Kids Ticket deal going on through late March. So January and February you can definitely take kids for less money. So that's great.
So after Lunar New Year, the next thing that's coming in just 11 days later, February 28th until April 21st, it's going to be the Food and Wine Festival. So they just take down the Lunar New Year decorations and put up the food and wine decorations at DCA. And so it's going to be the Food and Wine Festival. As we talked about in the Walt Disney World episode, spring breaks are very spread out this year. I think, Leslie, you were telling me even in California itself, they're pretty spread out just between the different public school systems because Easter is so late, because it's all the way in the third week of April. So that's good and bad. It's never going to be low crowds, but it's never going to be one crushing spring break crowd. So that's good. One thing I would love to hear you talk about, Leslie, is Disneyland apparently realizes that Galaxy's Edge exists and that they can do things Star Wars related and celebrate Star Wars. And so this season of the Force, it's running March 28th to May 11th. So overlaps with Food and Wine a little bit. I assume it's happening mostly at Galaxy's Edge, so it's in Disneyland, not DCA. But I know you haven't necessarily been yourself, but being the Disneyland buff that you are, what can people expect for this Seasons of the Force?
So I'm really curious to watch it this year. I mean, it hasn't really been much. The focus of Season of the Force is, of course, on May the 4th, because that's Star Wars Day, and everybody wants to go that day. And then they have some Star Wars nights after hour celebrations in that same period. And then traditionally they've had the Hyperspace Mountain overlay on Space Mountain. Actually, not as much happening in Galaxy's Edge, but the reality is I think, and I'm guilty of this myself, I don't go back there very much. It's so far back in the back of the park. And, I forget about it, even if maybe Disneyland doesn't, but they do tend to, hype up the characters and just have a little bit more action going on during this time of year. But it really is meant to funnel people, I think, into those after hours events. So it's not a full scale festival. So don't plan on it being like that. There's no food special. I mean, I guess there are special foods in the regular restaurants, but there's not like a food festival element to it. And there's not, major celebrations. So just watch for that. I don't think we know all of the details yet as to what's going to be happening. And so it's a little bit of an afterthought in the last minute, but it's better than nothing.
It is better than nothing. Looking at you, Walt Disney World. I will also shout out, for those of you who don't know, I think they're still running in Star Wars Galaxy's Edge the Fire of the Rising Moons fireworks, it's the same fireworks that are happening at the regular castle, but you're watching from Galaxy's Edge and they're playing Star Wars music instead, and they've managed to sync everything up. So it's like there's two shows using the same fireworks at the same time. And I've heard a lot of great things about the Fire of the Rising Moons fireworks. So even when you're not in Seasons of the Force, make sure they're trying to get you back there to Galaxy's Edge, buy some merch, check out the special fireworks show.
That's right. I don't think I've seen it yet myself. So I don't know. It might be a while because I'm not going to be in Disneyland this next trip. I'm just going to be in DCA, but one day. And if you're a Star Wars super fan, definitely look into some of this. I think a lot of us got Star Wars fatigue after the opening, and I don't give it its due as much as I ought to compared to its fandom. So I understand. All right. So yeah, lots going on in March and April, and that's going to be a high crowd period, but the crowds are going to be spread out, like you said.
So then May, we're rolling into the 70th on May 16th, as we said. So starting the 70th over the summer, what do you expect crowds to look like for the summer up until, when school starts again?
So the last, 5+ years, maybe a little more than that, summer hasn't been a super, super high crowd time. I expect things will shift a little bit this year. And I do expect that in early June, especially, that a lot of folks are going to want to get those 70th offerings under their belt. So I do think the 70th could drive higher crowds through the summer. But the reality is a lot of people, pass holders are blocked out unless you have like the highest pass. So a lot of the locals are essentially blocked out. And There aren't a lot of low one day tickets. So that does, drive people away who are local, maybe just wanting to buy like a one day. It's not the cheapest time of year to go. So I do think crowds will be solid and steady, but I don't think they're going to be crushing during the summer. It is hot, so you do get heat waves depending upon the time of year. But I do think that demand is for the 70th is going to be high because there's so many entertainment offerings that have so much good buzz around them that I do think I'm expecting May 16th to be very busy. And I've been looking at actually some crowd calendars, and that's not reflected on a lot of crowd calendars yet. I'm actually really surprised, and maybe it's because it hasn't really registered yet, but I expect it to be very busy in late May and early June.
All right, so then rolling into fall, am I reading this wrong? Is Disneyland falling into the Walt Disney World trap of starting Halloween earlier and earlier? I thought that it started in early September last year, but am I seeing August 22nd for Halloween time stuff?
No. This past year was when they made the change, Joe. They actually moved it up to August in 2024, and they are continuing that in 2025. Halloween has just been so popular at Disneyland that they realized they needed to spread the crowds out more. And the last 2 weeks of August were a very, very slow time because a lot of Southern California schools go back like second week of August. So Disney saw the opportunity and seized upon it to expand Halloween time. And Halloween time runs August 22nd through October 31st. But I believe the first Oogie Boogie Bash is actually before August 22nd. So they are fully going all in with the way Walt Disney World does it. Got to sell those Halloween party tickets. And something that's really important to note is quite a few of the 70th anniversary entertainment offerings will be on pause once Halloween time starts. So you won't, I'm trying to remember exactly what ends and what begins, but some of the nighttime entertainment will not be the 70th lineup. So that's something to keep in mind date wise if you really want to see all of the offerings for the 70th and you go during Halloween time, then you won't get to do it.
That's good to know. And so in the fall, you really want to avoid the long weekends, Indigenous Peoples Day, Veterans Day. You want to avoid those. Thanksgiving is really crowded. And then Christmas holiday in Disneyland, Leslie, is it like Walt Disney World, or are enough of the locals blocked out that it doesn't get as crazy?
No, it's crazy. I mean, Christmas week itself is crazy, but there are a lot of the same sweet spots that you see at Walt Disney World that first week in December. Although you noted on our Disney World episode, it was a little different the way it shook out this past year because of Thanksgiving falling so late. But used to be at Disneyland that Veterans Day weekend was the launch of the Disneyland holiday season. And this, starting last year and continuing this year, they are starting the holidays a little bit later after that Veterans Day weekend. And I think that actually will make Veterans Day a little bit more reasonable crowd-wise because it used to just be awful, 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 awful. Now, Indigenous Peoples Day, Columbus Day weekend is the awful, awful, awful 3-day fall weekend. Veterans Day is a little more sane. So just keep that in mind. But, Thanksgiving week itself, Christmas, between Christmas and New Year's, and even basically until the kids go back to school in January is quite crushing at Disneyland. And even though everybody's blocked out, anybody who's visiting family in the LA area is getting those one-day tickets and going to Disneyland.
Disney displaying patience on the Christmas creep. Will wonders never cease? Who would have thought? So that's good to know. All right. So it looks like overall Disneyland, it is a good year to go. If you can find a sweet spot, that's a good time to go. I will reiterate what you said, Leslie, that the summer is quite hot. And remember that unlike Walt Disney World in the summer in Disneyland, even though it's not as humid, a lot of the attractions, like a lot of the stuff is outside. It's a Small World starts outside. Queues are outside more. There's just less indoor air conditioning like you would see in Florida. So that's something to bear in mind. All right. So for this Disneyland, when to go to Disneyland 2025 overview episode, Leslie, what's your Disney do or don't for us if we're planning trips to Disneyland this year?
So it's really important, I think, if you're trying to find a low crowd time to go, which is harder and harder to do, pay attention to two calendars that I think a lot of out-of-towners don't necessarily pay attention to. Pay attention to the Magic Key calendars and see when those magic key holders are blocked out, and more importantly, when a long block-out period ends. Because as soon as that's lifted, a lot of them want to come back to the parks the next week, and that can actually be a really high crowd time. Is, I've been blocked out for a month, and suddenly I can go, and they all go. So pay attention to that. Pay attention as well to the one-day ticket tier calendars. And, Disneyland has these one-day tickets that are tier 0 through tier 6. And those tier 0 days are very important for locals who are on a budget. People wait for those tier 0 days. They are very popular, and that can actually drive crowds up on tier 0 days. But the whole point is they're supposed to be low demand days, and they suddenly become high demand days because of the prices. So pay attention to that when you're looking at, your vacation. But again, it's Disneyland. Don't stress. If you're going to get something like Lightning Lane, which I think you should at Disneyland because it's a great value, you can dodge a lot of the issues in a high crowd day just by knowing how to use Lightning Lane and maximizing it.
Good call. Last thing I'll say is that remember that Disneyland still requires park reservations. And so if you are in LA visiting family, thinking of going, et cetera, in my experience, usually, like most times of the year, it's January 23rd as we're recording. Usually, like January 25th, both parks have reservations. So it can't be a key for when it's a low crowd, but it definitely can be a key for when it's a high crowd, because if you see that one of the parks is sold out, then it's likely that everything's going to be pretty crowded. So, use those park reservations as a little bit of a dipstick to figure out what the crowds are like. But more importantly, don't forget to make them, because you're not getting in if you don't. Yeah.
Very, very important. And it's a hard framework for Walt Disney World folks to get into because, we still have park hopping restrictions and we still have park reservations. Crazy.
We're free in Walt Disney World for once. So, all right. Well, that does it for this episode. If you have any questions about Disneyland, please email us disneydeciphered@gmail.com. Find us on social media, Disney Deciphered, at WWDeciphered on Twitter. Leslie, where can people find your work? And make sure you give me a Disneyland Disneyland article to throw into the show notes. But where can people find your work on the internet?
I am tripswithtykes.com. Better yet, we'll throw 2 into the show notes. I have like a 2025 planning guide, and then I also have a post about all of the special events in 2025. So you can dig down on the dates. And where can folks find you, Joe?
You can find me at AsJoeFlies all over social media. And if you're looking to book a trip, Disney World, Disneyland, Disney Cruise, anywhere really, you can reach out, Joseph Chung at travelmation.net. All right, that does it for this episode. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And other than that, Leslie, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. And I will see you in Disney's California Adventure in like a week.
Thanks, Joe.